The story begins with the fact that the brain is the latest mind, which performs hundreds of billions of calculations per second. The frame is an alloy of light aerospace titanium, which is characterized by low weight and high hardness. The power module is a concentration reactor of solar energy. The skin absorbs the material created in vacuum, similar to human. Therefore, soon his developer called the customer and said that the android has already been made. However, the person who made an order demanded to see his robot in order to avoid problems with the return of goods in the future. Therefore, Lin decided to call the customer a video call so that he could see everything in detail and make sure of his choice. Before turning on the camera, the guy pressed a special button that was hidden behind the android hair so as not to arouse suspicion. The robot was identical to man, but his voice was recorded, and at first it was ordered to give an order to demonstrate the ability to speak and follow instructions. First, the customer on the other side of the screen asked the robot girl to smile, what she obediently did, using the desired set of emotions. After that, the man demanded from the android certain behavior that he could enjoy in the future use. The robot began to spin in different directions and making a turn. She obediently took up her skirt and, calling the customer the owner, congratulated him on the return. Each part of the android was performed qualitatively and identical to the human body. The only thing that issued was a large number of wires that were supplied. But despite certain restrictions, the work managed to easily perform various movements and have good flexibility. Meanwhile, Lin thought about how good it was to have so much money, and instead of useful expenses, just to make an obedient doll for himself. The customer had already enjoyed his toy and ordered her to stop immediately, after which she stopped moving and completed an instruction. The developer asked the client whether it was necessary to make any changes. But the man was satisfied with everything, and he said that he would soon send an address to which he needed to place an order. In addition, the stranger really liked the technique of the guy, so he invited him to get to know new people who could come in handy. Lin was pleased to get such a bonus, but most of all he was interested in the question of who was the prototype of this android, since he corresponded to a specific person. However, the man did not want to answer this question, and the guy thought that this could be the first love of the customer with whom he could not build life. But when he uttered these words out loud, a strong explosion occurred nearby, the fire from which filled the entire office. When Lin returned to his development, he saw a stranger who had a rather large physique and an unknown face, which was closed by the mask. The man was much larger than the boy, so he should not grab him by the neck and to bear with one hand to the appointed place. But as it turned out, there were two invaders, and only one of them took up the interception of a young man who did not understand why the event burst into him. Linnea hit the head greatly, because of which his weak body quickly lost consciousness and could not resist, because it was impossible to even hold his head. The men were armed and ready for any course of events, and Lin himself was already lying on the ground and gradually began to open his eyes, seeing the earth in front of him. But soon he managed to raise his head a little, and the last android appeared in front of him, which he had just had to send to the customer. The guy tried to scream and even held out his hand to the robot, but his attempts were immediately suppressed, and his hand was almost broken due to the strong pressure of one of the strangers. Linnea hit the head again and he lost consciousness. Then they took the last android, and together with the guy, the criminals carried them along. Lintina was taken to an unfamiliar place and recorded all the information. As it turned out, he was 26 years old, and he worked in the android maintenance department. Boss Van became interested in the boy, who considered him the last garbage and believed that the young man climbs where he had no place at all. When Tin completely came to his senses, he began to panic strongly, since his whole body was entwined with wires, and there was a special helmet on his head, which was very crushing. But when he decided to ask why he was seized, Boss Van stood near the last android and asked Lin if he knew who this girl was. The guy knew absolutely nothing about the prototype of this robot, since even when trying to find out, he was quickly refused and threw a phone. And now, when he was so close to the answer to this question, he received a strong blow to the head with a fist of one of the men who abducted him. Due to the great power in the hands of the criminal, the guy was left without one tooth, who could not withstand such pressure, and flew out with blood and pain. Boss Van asked his guard so that he would not spread his hands. However, a man could not calmly look at the guy who used the appearance of his daughter, in law for android. At that moment, Lin Tin realized that the customer was very deceiving him, and now he would have to repay his own life for someone else's mistake. Now the guy tried to justify himself and said that he was simply obediently fulfilling the order, not suspecting who it could be. He was ready to destroy the robot if he was only released and forget about this situation. without attracting to the disclosure of the police. But Van did not consider it necessary to destroy Android, since she wore his wife's face, so he did not want to go to such radical measures. Then Lin realized that it would be better to give this robot to Van and he will become its master, and he himself will find this customer and figure it out. Under the influence of fear, the guy was ready to do everything that Boss Van would wish. If only he would not have anger again and get out of this room alive. But while he watched the picture, as a special helmet lies on his own hands, which can control the thoughts of the robot, Van ordered Linya to follow his tongue, since the android he made was really perfect. But this is just a car, and the man was interested in whether they could have consciousness. Tin began to worry strongly and suspected what exactly the man was going to do. But this matter was illegal. In addition, it was just a theory. Then Van turned to his colleagues and said that given the level of knowledge of the guy, it is not surprising that he created such an android. However, in this case, it was about the dignity that Tin touched that he created a robot with his wife's face. So now only death was waiting for him. The boss did not want to say anything else, but only went to the robot and touched the button on the helmet, which was dressed on her head. When Lin saw this, then tears and fear of death appeared on his face. But given his position, he could not solve anything. The eyes of the guy and android at the same time became white, and their bodies radiated severe energy and radiance, which brought severe pain for humans. Laziness shouted from what he felt in his body. But now he understood that his worthless life was over, and suddenly the whole story of his existence flew before his eyes. At first, in childhood, he did not receive parental love, and he had to be raised to the old grandfather. Young Tin's ratings were good, but he did not have an option to learn badly, as the money was barely enough for existence. However, in a matter of years, he managed to get a huge order for Android, and the result, on his watering, turned out to be incredibly perfect. Remembering all this, Lin did not want to die. He could not quit all his merits, for which he had to pass a difficult childhood. Boss Van saw the screams of the guy and how blood came from his eyes. He was surprised that he was such a height of current. The body of a young man could still function. After all, before other subjects, the brain died for 10 seconds, which could not be said about the line of Tina. Suddenly, the system that applied voltage had a message about the excess of standard rhythm, the consequences of which were unknown. After the warning, strong changes really began. Even a strong helmet on the guy's head began to break into pieces, like thin paper. And in a matter of seconds there was a huge explosion, from which all those present in that room suffered, since the fire managed to go beyond the building. After about thousands of kilometers from that terrible place, on one of the old doors, the last green leaflet. It was evening on the street and was quite calm, but the leaflet fell barely living body in his hand, which could barely breathe. Meanwhile, 2 local residents were in search of food, since they had to return home to an unknown road from a merchant who did not spare them. However, the search for spiritual fruits was the most profitable way in order to enter the period of Shi training, after which new opportunities will open before them. But while they wandered with unknown territories, they stumbled upon the body of a beautiful girl, which they did not notice in their village before. But the guys decided to use this body as meat. Now it remained only to find a spiritual fruit, and dinner would be guaranteed. However, at first they decided to check whether this girl was breathing, and under what conditions was in this position in this quiet place. To begin with, they tried to touch her hands, and then an eye to determine her physical condition by pupils. Suddenly, he opened her eyes with a careful touch, and her overlap. I was so frightened that it was difficult to describe in words. The guys were still arguing among themselves who was the first to enjoy the stranger, and did not notice the movements of her body. Meanwhile, the lifeless Lin could not understand why, even in the afterlife, the world is so noisy that he could not rest from what he experienced. Suddenly, the girl's face, who was very similar to that android, began to move, and a fright was visible behind her eyes. Simultaneously with her every movement, Tin realized that his body acquired female signs and did not understand what exactly happened to him over the last minutes of his life. But while the guys around only wanted to touch the body of a young lady, whose skin was white, like an angel, and soft, like a newborn child, suddenly, Tin recalled the words to Boss Van that the transfer of a person's consciousness into the body of the android never ended in real success. Then the girl's body rose, and Lin realized that it was he who leads him, and it turns out that the criminals managed to transfer his consciousness to his own robot. Strangers watched the movements of a beauty who tried to master her new body, and that it now looks completely different. Then Lin realized that the situation in which he is located wants to leave the best. After all, Now he, who is in the body of a woman's robot, is going to rape strangers. But then he recalled that when the danger is detected, thanks to his investment in this system, radishes of automatic protection and attack were launched. Therefore, no longer worried about his own security, Tin was able to strike a strong blow to men who only thought about him as a piece of meat. Now the guys tried not to lose a little, as the robot's blow was quite strong and unexpected, because of which he caused heavy damage. Laziness was proud of his development by the fact that he programmed the defense in it, because otherwise such a situation could not know how to end for him. However, he still did not understand in which place he ended up after a large explosion, and why these two villains harassed him among the night field. Then he began to carefully get up and examine the new area. As it turned out, judging by the landscapes, it was a world of cultivation, which looked different from the usual world. Lina managed to order strangers to give him their clothes, and now he asked as much as possible to anyone about the new place in which he got. As it turned out, the world of cultivation has no end, and the beginning, therefore, is divided into 9 main parts and 10 forbidden zones. According to the guys, the goal of all cultivators was to achieve immortality and free themselves from the shackles of the world, and then live forever. Now Lin began to realize that he would have to do a lot in order to at least achieve immortality. But besides, you also need to learn how to survive in these conditions. And although he now knows in general terms about the world, he has not yet managed to figure it out to the end. And relative to 2 strangers, he understood that they could be useful to him. But the information about their life was absolutely unknown to Tin. The guys considered Lina a good girl and called the older sister, being ready to fulfill her instructions like really servants. Tin ordered them to immediately name their names, surnames, place of work, where exactly they live. All this should have been briefly and in accordance with the case. However, such a wording of questions seemed strange to residents. But the guys had no choice, and one of them introduced themselves like a Kui, and the other called Zhao Si, and they both kneeling in front of the linum. As it turned out, they are ordinary inhabitants of the village, located near the mountain. After their village was in distress, they were forced to wander in search of a better life. On the way they met Immortal, and the guys envied them so much that they decided for themselves once and for all to become cultivators. They found Mount Minhan to join the sect, but there they were considered weak and driven out. Now they could not live in the village. They were not accepted into the sect, and they could only wander and rob passers-by. Linnea, even at some point, felt sorry for the guys because their story partially echoed his life, and he perfectly understood that he had 2 street children. But Tina needed a team and support to survive in this world, so he suggested that Chi and Zhao Si join him. But from that moment on, they would have to stop violating the laws, and Lin promised to share the cow and food with them. The guys sincerely rejoiced that they would now have a real mistress. So without unnecessary thought, they agreed to the proposal. At Chi and Zhao Si, they stopped calling the young man as his mistress, and this was insanely annoyed, since he still considered himself a guy, despite the physical signs of another sex. Tina had to be in private for some time, go to think through the forefront for survival and how to position himself in this world. Soon he approached his new servants and said that those main ones obey him, because he would not offend them and would not throw words into the wind. The guys rejoiced that she would have to be a servant for such a beautiful girl who, moreover, is very smart and can control them. And since Tin understood the structure of his own body, because he developed it with his own hands, he quickly decided to get rid of unnecessary details that only caused more views and attention. From the guys saw, their mouths opened, because for the first time they saw how a person can independently discard part of himself simply into the air. However, Lin asked her not to call him his mistress, because it humiliated his male dignity. Now the guys understood with whom they deal with, so they behaved restrainedly, and from now poured the older sister by the boss. This satisfied Lina, but he still sought to return his old body, and was ready for a terrible fight if someone calls him a girlfriend. Laziness indicated to follow him, and at the same time thought out every next step, and the guys asked where they were now heading. Then the young man thought, but he could not attach all his plans to the new subordinates. But his goal was only the return of his real type. Suddenly, a strong wind began and some lightning flashed in the sky. Tin was frightened from what he saw, as he was not ready for weather changes. The wind intensified and almost knocked the people who were on the ground. This was a strange phenomenon for the usual mortal. Not seeing this in the ordinary world, Lin asked new friends that it had just happened to them and how they managed to survive. Then Chi suspected that it could be one of the immortal. They are very strong and usually neglect ordinary people. Zhao Si asked a friend to be careful and follow the words, At that moment, Lin realized that in the world of cultivation, like on Earth, all people are divided in the same way into strong and weak. Therefore, someone holds everyone in fear. Given the new opportunities of the guy's body, he interceded a special scan through his eyes, which allowed him to see the little things that were invisible to ordinary people. Now he became aware that Qi is a lower-level master, and in his strength very little prevails over an ordinary person. The same could be said about Zhao Si. Lin Tin was not just a dozen stronger than these guys, but falling into his eyes an impudent and strong cultivator, then nothing would have left of the guy. Therefore, while they kept their way in search of food, he tried to invent an idea where it would be possible to take a lot of resource for pumping combat skills. Therefore, not knowing the new world perfectly, the guy turned to his new team to get some advice on skill. So far, Lina was interested in where in this village you can find the nearest place for trade. The boys did not immediately understand the question, since they only knew about the market. Their vocabulary was slightly different, but soon Tin explained everything, and the guys indicated that they needed to go in the opposite direction. Without the strength and choice, the team still had to return to the place where they started their journey, and soon they arrived in the market of the eastern city. Zhao Shi on Q Kui most interested in treasures, which they immediately paid attention after the threshold of the market. However, Lin himself drew attention to the scroll that lay nearby near the brilliant precious lenses. But it was impossible to deploy parchment, so the guy applied the activation of the optical analysis system to find out all the information. As it turned out, the treasures were spiritual stones that served as a special material used to make a magic gun. And the scroll became a material for self-improvement. These things would be good in order to improve their abilities and become stronger in the world of cultivation. Suddenly, Lin felt electromagnetic waves, with the help of which Immortal could communicate with other similar ones nearby. Then Tin began to worry, since the number of these waves indicated that there are many dangerous persons around him, with whom you need to be careful. In such a world, you need to find a way of rapid cultivation as quickly as possible in order to primarily protect yourself, and then extract a resource. Therefore, while the guy decided to try to improve strength with the help of a spiritual stone, and asked the elder man how much it costs, the owner of such treasures answered him that he was taking 2 coins for a half kilogram of stones and not a drop less. Zhao Xiaonuqi began to express their dissatisfaction, saying that such a price was too high and resembled a robbery in the midst of white day. But according to the seller, only these boys thought so. As it turned out, it was no longer possible to find such a cheap stone anywhere, since in all other places it would only be more expensive. In addition, all these stones were spilled by the Tian family, so the price is about the same everywhere. And if someone does not have enough money, then you should not take the path of cultivation at all. The last words were very touched by Lin Tina, who was used to not to give up and go to the last. But here they tried to humiliate him and did not begin to believe in his strength. But as soon as he turned to the seller, he was frightened of his gaze and said in a trembling voice that the guys buy the goods, or go away. However, Lin was not going to use physical strength and just left, and that seller remained with a feeling of fear until the end of the day. All this time, they were followed by a stranger who had never met such insightful people as a girl in whose body Lena's consciousness lived. Then this woman felt excitement and realized that her trip to the eastern city was becoming even more interesting every minute. But while she was thinking about what she had just seen, the young man approached her and ordered him to take the way without a drop of respect. Then the woman had to take off her hood and show an unusual appearance, which excused her red eyes. The guy had already regretted that he turned to a beautiful lady in such a manner, so his behavior changed to shame and his face blushed. Suddenly the stranger held out her hand to his head and asked, did he really dare to speak to her and order what to do? Then the young man felt that the beautiful lady was squeezing his chin too much, and soon he felt hurt from her hands. The woman's gaze changed along with the color of her eyes, and she said that she had run away from the chase for too long, that now she was not in the best mood. Suddenly, the stranger came too close to the young man, and the same waves that Lin managed to feel in the market began to leave. From the pain and the unexpected course of events, he dropped all the spiritual stones that carried it in a trading shop for sale, and it was at that moment that Lin felt some changes in space, as if something had happened very close to him. But he could not influence it. The only thing he felt was very electromagnetic waves that were confused and inspired a sense of fear. Therefore, while everyone around continued purchases for a week and lived their usual life, Lin suffered because of his certain superpowers, which indicated him in danger. He was interested to find out whose energy is still in the air and radiates such strong electromagnetic waves. However, at first he needed to concentrate on cultivation, and engage in similar riddles already when he had a sufficient level of power. Then he returned to his subordinates who had already turned their pockets to prove that they had spent the last money, and now they have nothing to buy stones for. They were sure that their new boss is much smarter and was much better about money, so they should not be contacted in this matter. However, Linnea did not like when someone was sitting nearby all the time on a bad life, and he himself did not even have one connection. What to talk about high-quality cultivation? The guys from the team began to cry. They say earlier the boss promised that he would not offend them, and now he was ready to leave without the last penny. Meanwhile, the old man who had many stones started a conversation with Mr. Janey, who brought him many new goods. But this gentleman belonged to the fat man, and said that he was not fashionable to use scrolls. They are only for young masters and ladies from wealthy families of the eastern city. Carefully overheard the conversation between the two men. The idea came up with the development of combat forces. The guy tried to use the abilities of his body to the maximum, so he remembered another opportunity, which he himself programmed. He could rewrite information from the scrolls and exchange them for spiritual stones. Now there is an activation of electronic brain circuits and maximum use of memory. Then he gave the money to the guys from the team and ordered them to immediately buy paper and mascara with brushes to write everything down. Then he said that in an hour they should meet near the same stall with spiritual stones, and he noticed that the young men would not escape with his paper and money. But for the guys it was a shame that in fact it was their money, which they decided to give to the new boss so that he treated them better. And Lin himself decided to follow Mr. Janam and noticed that he was heading for a shop with a rare technique for cultivators. Near the store stood a little girl who asked for alms, but the man treated her like a bad dog, because of which everything was in the mud. Noticing the attitude of the master, Lin thought about the fact that now it would be difficult for him to get into the store and fulfill his task. Meanwhile, the young Mr. Jian who was tried to console his servants and said that his girlfriend simply does not value a good attitude towards herself and demands a lot, took place. However, the second son of the famous family Jian in the eastern city sincerely fell in love. And, according to him, no one could understand his feelings. Nearby, Tin's Linen, who was still trying to come up with a plan in order to get into a shop with an inventory for cultivation. But as soon as he turned around, he met with Jian who immediately noticed a beautiful girl and already switched to her. Despite the fact that a second earlier he convinced the servants of the sincerity and fidelity of his feelings for Tianzhou, who wanted to marry, he immediately ran to Linnea, who looked like an attractive girl outwardly and enthusiastically asked her name. The servants became ashamed of the defeated by their master, but they could not point him to some mistakes, so they simply stood in silence, without interfering. And Lin realized that this guy, who was well-dressed and was generally well-groomed in appearance, could become the one who would take it inside the store. At that moment, one of the servants thought about what sincere love and marriage of their master could be discussed when he immediately switched to a new girl, and Tin decided that it was time to use the possibility of a temptation of men, regarding which the customer of this android had a special request. But when the guy turned on this opportunity, Mr. Jian almost jumped out from what he saw and heard. Laziness also turned on the Super Wing audio packet for the temptation, and said in a worthy voice that he would like to get to the store. Meanwhile, Zhao Si and Qi waited for their boss near a bench with stones, having a paper and mascara. They quickly completed everything in accordance with the order. Suddenly they heard a girlish voice, which irritably asked if Vanji really went for the materials, and still has not returned. As it turned out, it was a girl of 16 years old named Tianzhou. She was the daughter of the owner of the workshop and also the lover of Mr. Jiang. She complained about Vanji, who they say is becoming more impudent. He dared to delay the manufacture of attributes for one of the respected families of the city, and it was strange, since the girl mercilessly saw him in the market, and he stood nearby with the materials close to the workshop. But while the girl in an angry mood complained about the master, she did not immediately notice two guys who were sitting right on the stairs to the bench. Tianzhou looked rather harsh, and her appearance scared Zhao Si and Qi, which is already worried about her social status in this city. The girl seemed to radiate anger through the energy that fell into the air and touched every inhabitant near her. The guys did not know how to do it better, since the young lady looked more dangerous than their boss, and could cause them more harm. But suddenly Tianzhou came closer to them and asked, "Did the young men from the village of Xishan," as she heard about the tragedy that happened there. The girl understood that the guys had a hard time, so she asked Uncle Chan to find suitable clothes for them and fed. Now the guys could calmly eat and were well dressed, as their past clothes were taken by Lin Tin, who arrived in the world of cultivation absolutely without nothing. The girl from the master's family now looked really kind in the eyes of Zhao and Yu, so they were infinitely grateful to her for such concern. Meanwhile, Van Ji soon arrived, whom the lady had been waiting for so long, and was ready to kill him for such a delay with the delivery of materials. However, the guy behaved rather strangely, and did not even raise his head to the venerable lady, despite the fact that she spoke to him. She could not stand it, and said that everyone had been waiting for raw materials for a long time, and due to poor work by a guy, she has to linger with work. But when she touched the guy, he turned to face her and it looked crippled. The eyes sparkled with a bright green radiance, which was not inherent in ordinary humanity. Zhao took Lin Tina to the store and was ready to buy anything for him. The servants of the master served a new guest as best as possible, who cooked his female appearance. It seemed to Tina that after using the technique, the temptation of a man around began to behave like animals. But such a conductor satisfied him. This was precisely for him, because now he could redeem the whole shop, but was afraid that he would have caused too much attention to himself from the stronger ones. As soon as the young man opened the first book, the activation of the electronic schemes of the brain and the maximum use of memory began. Tin was ready to record everything that his eyes see, since each word can come in handy in future cultivation. The store owner noticed the strange behavior of the guests and asked what was happening in the hall, where you can read some materials. However, Jenner felt a condemning gaze into his back and immediately quickly turned his head to pay attention to the person who allowed himself to look at him for so long. But as soon as Mr. Jang noticed the evil look and features of the face of the young master, he immediately asked what caused this behavior, since he suspected that they wanted to rob him. At that moment, Jian quickly ran to the store owner and threw several scrolls and books into his hands, because of which the old man was frightened. But as it turned out, the young master asked the man to check everything, pack and convey to the girl who stands in the readership, and he would pay for everything. And Lin Tin himself understood that he was better to get rid of this company, so as not to cause unnecessary suspicions. Therefore, it would be better to erase the memory of men. Therefore, having quickly finished with his affairs, the guy took some materials and, leaving the store, continued to read the information. Now he was glad that he turned off the function of the temptation in time, because the fool Jian was ready to rewrite the whole shop to him. But soon he approached the fat man to the cellar, and thought about the fact that it would never have been superfluous to have an additional source of knowledge. But when the guy turned to the cellar, the old man immediately got angry and said that he would not make discounts for strangers. At that moment, Lin took out a notebook, which he signed himself as an instruction for weight loss and simultaneous cultivation. These two questions were relevant for the old fat man who could not increase his fighting force, despite the fact that he always had access to spiritual stones. Therefore, when he saw this material before his eyes, he almost began to dance with joy and longed to get all the information. And when Lin saw a similar reaction of the old man, he directly told him that he would exchange this book for a certain number of spiritual stones. Meanwhile, Tan Zhou, who had been waiting for materials near the attribute workshop for so long, tried to find out what had happened to her worker. Van Ji could not hold the stones from which the girl could make precious things to cultivate, which aroused suspicion. But as it turned out, he threw the stones out of his hands specifically in order to unexpectedly swing at his mistress, who managed to evade the attack. Tanzhou could not understand what happened to the guy and who bit him, that he became so frantic as a wild dog. Suddenly, the guy shouted to the mistress, calling her a little insignificance, which has no right to manage him and indicate what to do. Zhao Si and Qi were surprised how the guy allowed himself to swing the girl, and behaves worse than their boss. Now the question arose, it would be correct to defend their savior Tian. But as it turned out, Lin Tin, who was waiting for his papers, did not go for a long time, and the guys themselves were waiting for their boss. However, Lin did not perceive them for real colleagues, so the maximum they occupied the level of some fools who could be used for cultivation. But Tin from afar noticed the strange behavior of the guys who shouted almost throughout the street and wanted to find help to save Tian. The girl herself was already used to the fact that Van Ji often treats her with disrespect. But on this day, he not only dragged on with work, but also allowed himself to hit her. At that moment, Lin at a distance was able to analyze a new character for himself, and found out that the girl was 16 years old, and her combat power was 80 units, despite the fact that she was an ordinary person. But according to Lin, the girl was a real cultivator, given the level of her strength. Suddenly, the guy began to scream at his subordinates for the fact that they would have to buy paper, and as a result they are found with cultivators, which is dangerous. But according to the guys, the shadow of Zhao was a rather pleasant girl who not only found clothes for them, but also allocated food for both. Laziness did not want to listen to this nagging, and taking the guys by the blouses began to pull along so that they no longer create a loyal of his unnecessary problems. Meanwhile, the old girl's old grandfather came out to Tanjo and Vanji and asked what happened between the young couple. But at first he turned to the young man and said that they should not quarrel, because then they would not have time to complete the order in the future. There will be nothing to live on. Tanjo asked her grandfather to leave to rest, because recently he is very sick, and she could cope with everything herself. Lin heard these words and turned to his subordinates, saying that he should not worry about a girl who herself can figure out her problems. Meanwhile, Vanji came closer to his grandfather and said that without his work they were nobody, so they should listen to his instructions, and not vice versa. Tin was still nearby and overheard the conversation, because of which he became embarrassed in his soul, since it would still be good to intervene in this conversation. Zhao Xinqi also did not want to leave now, because they understood that the situation could end badly, and then a good person would suffer. Vanji continued to put pressure on his family, and told the old man with a direct text that he had been waiting for his death for a long time. Tanjo could not believe what she hears, as the guy has long become part of their business, and also family. But now he was happy to continue to repeat that he was waiting for his grandfather's death in order not to work for him anymore and do his own work. Suddenly, a bastard received a strong blow to the head that blood flew from his mouth. He did not expect someone nearby to be so strong. Tanju herself was frightened because she did not know that someone else was next to them. Therefore, when Tina saw in the image of a fragile girl, she was very surprised. However, Tin himself understood that it was better not to interfere in the fight of two strong cultivators, but no longer restrained himself and decided to test his own strengths. After Lin saw a terrible attitude towards the old man, he immediately told his grandfather who saved him in childhood. But at a certain moment, criminals appeared who hunted the old man for selling them poor quality goods, and now men longed for revenge. Grandfather could not fulfill the conditions that they set for him, so ruthless criminals were ready to kill him in order to throw all their negatives into him. The little Linnea had to watch his grandfather's death with his own eyes, and how much he suffered from the blows received. Therefore, when he heard a trigger phrase regarding the death of the old Tanjo, he could not restrain his desire for revenge, and hit the unworthy Vanzea. Tina managed to protect the old man, so he remained unharmed, and his granddaughter was shocked by what he saw. Jiaoxi and Qi also did not expect such power from their boss, and now they themselves felt in danger under her control. After all, the fight between Lin and Vanjie ended in the fact that a huge hole in the wall, which he struck with his own body, remained from the latter. After what they saw, the subordinate Lina was incredibly proud of him and had already begun to adopt the merits of the boss on themselves a little. However, Tanjo was worried that in her workshop there are not enough workers, and if Zhu was scorched to death, then they would have to stop the work at all. Grandfather asked Qi who this is a stranger. The guy explained that this is their boss, which looks like a fragile girl externally, and inside she is a real strength. Laziness realized that he should apologize, because such situations when his emotions cannot be controlled can lead to poor consequences. But when he spoke, Tanjiao was surprised from the male timbre he heard, who would not have to be inherent in such a young lady. Suddenly, because of that large hole, Vanji's hand appeared in the rock, who barely managed to get together with his strength to get to his feet and get out back. The guy was all in scratches, and blood flowed from his nose. However, his gaze was so wild that it seemed he was not going to retreat after the attack. Indeed, immediately after that, he waved his fist on the line. They say he had no right to allow himself to raise his hand on him, and as soon as he approached the limb to the female body, Lin, the latter quickly dodged and delivered another blow to the villain's head. Tin turned to Vanji with the words that he does not know him, so he does not understand what exactly was being discussed. Now, when the repentant lay on the ground and tried to recover, holding his hand over his head, his neck hidden behind his hair became visible. The young Madame Tanjo drew attention to the naked part of her worker's body, and one of the versions of what happened occurred to her. The guy was aggressively opposed to everyone around him, but now a stranger deserved special attention in which the consciousness of Linu lived. Now Jai was ready to kill her, but Tan intervened in time and loudly ordered that the subordinate immediately stops. Her voice was quite loud, so everyone reacted to the sound and instantly stopped the movement for a while. After that, the young lady turned to Vanji and reminded that he had long wanted to lead the workshop. Besides, he had a really good talent for this. Therefore, now the JOU is ready to give him such an opportunity. The boy was delighted and did not even pay attention to the pain from the blows that spread throughout the body. from the head to the tips of the fingers. But in order to really take this position, he needed to win the competition, and the girl, as an heir on behalf of the family, Tien promises that if Tsu wins, he will become the main thing in this place. But having heard such conditions, he only laughed. They say no one in the eastern city will be able to compare with them, unless the old grandfather and Tan herself. Meanwhile, Lin restrained himself so as not to use the power of the new body again, and not to hit Van as much as possible so that he would not joke like that. Tan also had its own plan for the proposal for the position. So she said that it would really have to compete for the director's place. After all, now she drew attention to a stranger who fought pretty well and had a sufficient level of strength to become an opponent for Jai. But when Lin heard that he would have to compete, he was shocked. A few minutes earlier, he ordered his subordinates not to interfere in fights, and now he will become its participant. Zhou came closer to him and begged for help, and Tin himself did not quite understand what happened and actually just passed by. But the girl was ready to give 2 spiritual stones as gratitude. The linea was not enough, and now he demanded at least 3, which they came together on. Meanwhile, at the entrance of the courtyard of the famous Jian family, a young gentleman appeared, whom the servant met and asked if the boy managed to buy what he planned. The young man was very tired and asked the old man not to bother. It was so hard for him in his soul, because of inseparable love, that he did not want to say. According to the old man, was always a loner, so no one could teach him to love, and even more so not mutually. But it seemed to the young man that he was in a dream in which he fell in love with at first sight. Soon, the fat man was tired of listening to pink fairy tales, so the young gentleman decided to go to heaven and ask what love is in their world. As soon as Jiang went his way to another part of the estate, Uncle Van was relieved to exhale and could continue to enjoy silence. Suddenly, one of the students came to him and reported that the long-awaited guests had finally arrived and were ready for a warm reception. Soon a team came from the pupils of the Shena Palace. They came with the order to deal with the devil who bewitched the eldest son of the family. Uncle Van was glad to see men, since recently they have become the only hope of recovering the guy. The old man ordered the student to tell the owner about the visit of respected guests from the Shena Palace, and prepared everything for acquaintance with them. The fat man began to hold a short tour for the pupils, and soon held them to the head of the Zen family. Meanwhile, the same stranger with unusual eyes and a beautiful appearance continued to watch all the news in the eastern city. After a short tour, Mr. Van led the guys to a separate hall, where important meetings of family members were usually held. The head of the family, Jong, was infinitely grateful to the guys and their teacher for rearing their visit to their visit. His wife restrained her tears, said that their eldest son was not getting out of bed, and doctors shrugged their hands because they do not know how to help him. One of the students turned to Mr. and Madame Jane with the words of reassurance. But for a start, they needed to inspect the guy in order to start treatment. The servants were issued an order to bring the eldest son, who had to be transferred everywhere on the couch. As soon as the guy was brought in the room, everyone looked at him with horror. The appearance and complexion of the face forced the best. One of the young men leaned toward the patient and almost fell when he suspected what kind of diagnosis he could have. After all, near Mr. Jiang's face, it was already similar to a corpse, from which only bones and hair remained, and as if there were. The student immediately became clear that the case of the dark shackles of the collector of souls, who does not spare the bodies of the young man and sucks all living things from them. The patient's father was scared when he saw the reaction of the boy. But having gathered fear in a fist, nevertheless, he asked if there were any chances of saving his son. As it turned out, the seal, which was made by black technology, cannot be completely destroyed. However, it is possible to temporarily remove the shackles so that the young master does not suffer so much. The student will need 300 circles of spiritual taming to help and break all the flows of the surrounding energy. But one kind man from the palace was already writing about such an old Jeng, so he agreed with the local workshop on the manufacture of attributes. Meanwhile, the craftswoman Tan explained to Lena about those very spiritual circles. If you arrange them in large quantities in a certain territory, you can achieve a complete blocking of energy flow. Then, in this area, no cultivator can use their techniques and spells. Then Lin used his possibility of analyzing objects thanks to the special skills that were laid in his new body. He analyzed the circles of spiritual taming. It was a functional attribute and average in a degree of rarity. More effective when using several pieces at once. After reading everything to the end, Tina became clear that judging by his purpose, this subject was like a muffler. Soon, the Joe explained the purpose of the competition. who will be able to make the most codes in one day. That of the candidates will win. Linnea, not everyone liked the goal as he felt in conveyor production. However, its part of the team sincerely ached for its boss. For Vanji, such work was quite easy, since he was well versed in the internal structure of all attributes in the workshop. Then, in order to interfere with the Linnea, he asked him if the girl understands how to distinguish it correctly when spiritual taming. However, the JOU intervened in time, since Lin himself immediately began to threaten his fist. So as not to waste time on chatter, the girl went to Van and asked if he really did not want to become the main thing in their workshop and win this competition. The answer was obvious. To motivate the line, the girl approached him and asked if he really did not need spiritual stones, to which of course she received the expected answer. Therefore, now that everyone had their own goal, it was not necessary to spend more time and a large number of attributes were guaranteed. 2 tables were brought to the workshop, behind which were all materials for the manufacture of goods, so the competitions began. And although the stake of spiritual taming was an attribute of the middle level, it will require a lot of effort and time from the manufacturer. An ordinary person will not be able to make more than a dozen pieces. Tanju understood that the deadlines were settled, so you need to hurry and cast at least 100 circles. Now it was necessary that Vanji had to make at least 50 pieces, so that in total with other workers the right amount is already today. But the question also arose regarding Lin, who, in the eyes of the inhabitants of this world, looked like a fragile woman, who was not worth the hope of hopes. Moreover, when Zhao looked at the stranger at the desktop, she stood everything and sang a song under her breath. At that moment, the shadow calmly exhaled, because I did not initially count on this girl so as not to get upset in the end. But in order to experience the new one, she nevertheless approached her and noted that the competition has already begun, and the attributes need to be made. Then Laziness explained that they agreed only on his participation in the competition, but that he won them did not go. Therefore, there was no point in doing something if at the end he receives the promised stones. Tanjo felt awkward, but the brand new girl was right regarding the conditions in which they agreed for this competition. In addition, the young lady did not even know whether the new one could cast attributes, but still forced to participate. This seemed suspicious for the line. The JOU had nothing to say, since they began to suspect her of what she did not want to tell publicly, and now she could only agree that she would still fulfill the terms of the contract. But now she still does not understand what is happening. Suddenly, he approached Qi and contacted the boss, said that her opponent had already completed a dozen attributes. Therefore, he could soon win. Vanji turned to Linnea and asked with satisfaction, did anyone still think that he could go against him? These words became a motivation for Tin, so he still decided that he would have to state a special lesson for this villain. To get to work, Linnea needed to take part of its special opportunity and activate the analysis mode of a hidden entry. With the help of this possibility, Tin can analyze the process of casting attributes from the very beginning to the end. Therefore, further he tried to concentrate all the attention on circles in order to feel the idea of energy and carry it through his own body. Soon he managed to write down the process of how the opponent beats the stake. The case remained for the small one to find the relevant information. Tanzhou was surprised at such a sight and asked one of the boys what was happening now. In Qi, he explained that the boss does so quite often. Laziness stood as if dug into the ground and continued to analyze the castings of attributes that could do much faster, having no experience in this matter. Now, on the basis of a video analyzer and information search, he ordered systems to develop the fastest technology for manufacturing attributes. Vanji looked at the girl's rival, who looked like a jerk for him, because she pretended to be a stupid, but he could not even suspect that a system of instant manufacturing of attributes was created right before his eyes. Therefore, soon Lin took up work and directed his hand to the raw materials. He was able to endow the usual stones with special energy. When the girl went to work, everyone around was very surprised, since the support group has already lost all faith in the victory of this stranger. Now the hands of the new body of the line moved at an incredible speed that the human eye could not fix. In less than a second, he managed to create the first circle in his life, which looked identical in that he made Ji, having experience in this matter. Now the man thought about his own words regarding the girl, who at first glance seemed to him stupid and self-confident. Ready-made attributes were in the air around the girl, who put the most efforts to this matter as possible, and had every chance of victory. Spectators behind this spectacle did not have time to count the number of circles made, because every second there were more and more attributes. There were already more than 100. Tanzhou did not believe her eyes and wanted to know what kind of person it was in her team. But now it was not the main thing. Everyone was waiting for victory. Only a few minutes passed, and on the desktop, Lena was already lying 500 spiritual attributes, and a bunch of spectators gathered around it. When Van Ji approached the girl, she told him that now the title of the hero of the workshop belongs only to her. It was always difficult to withstand competition and experience his own defeats. So unable to restrain himself, he waved his fist to the winner. But some managed to react much faster, and the opponent was struck by a strong blow to his neck, due to which he was immediately excluded from the competition. As it turned out, it was Tanzhou, who barely managed to intervene in time, but was pleased with such dexterity. After Tsu fell to the floor, strange green smoke began to come out of his body, and Lin did not understand what exactly he saw before his eyes. Then the JIU reported that Van was always arrogant and vanity, but he would never have no bad responding to his comrades. And judging by his spiritual state, he was indeed subject to external influence, which led him to such a fate. The girl managed to get a spiritual seal from the guy's body. The negative emotions of the people who fell under this seal will increase and accumulate, and over time and influence behavior. Under favorable conditions for printing, it penetrates these and blood, spreading throughout the body. If the seal is forcibly destroyed at this time, then its carrier will die. And only when its owner is at the peak of emotions and his attention is focused on surrounding factors, you can safely remove it. Thanks to this knowledge, Tanzhou managed to observe the instructions and save his colleague from suffering. However, now he will have a little time to restore. Upon learning the whole truth, Lin realized that this was just an occasion to save Tsei as soon as possible. Then Tan decided that the time had come to meet. She held out her hand and naming her name said that she was the heiress of this 5th-generation workshop. Lin Tin shook the hand of a new acquaintance and introduced himself as a real name, reminded the girl of the promised spiritual stones. Suddenly, one of the working workshops came running and said that the second son of the Jong family and the manager of their houses want to find out when the order would be made. But now everything was fine, because thanks to the line of tin, they will be able to hand over work today, and this may accelerate the recovery of a sick son. But soon, Jianer himself came out, who asked if they were ready when dosed Taming. At that moment, he examined all the working workshop and noticed Lin Tina, whose female image was in love with the first seconds, or did not expect to meet again with an adored girl. So when he came closer, he almost lost his speechlessness. Jianer has changed a lot in his behavior, despite the fact that his official girl Tanzhou stood nearby, which he recently wanted to marry. Therefore, when the young lady noticed the changes in her beloved, she immediately remembered the fact that he always starts scandals. When she sees how sweet she was talking to someone, Lin also did not understand what was the matter, because before leaving the shop of cultivators, he erased everyone's memory, including Jian Era. Suddenly the man extended his hand forward and this movement was quite unexpected, inspiring fear for others. Tanzhou thought that the guy was going to start a quarrel due to the fact that she spent time with other people who were not familiar. Therefore, the girl decided to intervene and ask Jiang so that he would not enter into a fight because of her and not cripple a new friend. However, the guy had another goal. He carefully touched the hands of Lin and calling him a beautiful lady asked. They had never met anywhere before. Tin began to worry that his effect did not disperse, so taking his hands he introduced himself as his real name and said that he was actually a guy. But Jian did not pay attention to his words, enjoying a pleasant voice and an attractive appearance. Suddenly Tanzhou again intervened in the conversation of the guys and asked if they had already been familiar before, because it seemed that yes. Lin Tin cut off and said that he had not met with Jong. But the latter, in turn, only drew attention to his girlfriend, whom he did not immediately notice. Then the guy reported the annoying news that it was all over between the couple, since he met his true love named Lin Tin. But Uncle Van reminded the young man that they had come on an important matter. So not the time to talk about love when his older brother dies. Now young Jian returned to reality and directly asked the head of the workshop if their great order was ready. Tanzhou said with a smile that the workers were just engaged in call-off packaging. So soon the goods will be delivered to the palace. Hearing the answer, Jianer again switched to Lin Tina and calling him his sister asked if they could go for tea. Tin could not stand it and again said that he was a man. But Jiang was still on these words, and he was able to leave only when the old van began to push him. Lin was delighted that this impudent was finally behind him, and his ex-girlfriend Tan Zhao brought the promised stones. The guy was glad of his reward, but now he had a request to lend tools from the workshop for some time. The owner of the workshop did not worry too much for the inventory, but it had to be returned whole. Otherwise, it would have to be compensated for at his own expense. Lin took the girl as petty, but she, as the owner of the tools, had every right to set her conditions. After the conversation, the young Madame Zhou finished all the affairs in the workshop and turned around, went home. But Lin noticed that she did not leave Van Ji, who could not walk on his own after the seal of the spell. Therefore, Tin was surprised and asked why the girl would not leave the insolent. They say after what happened, she would have to be on him anyway. But the girl said that a person who is under the influence of technology can behave aggressively. But this does not mean that his true essence is manifested in this way, because those who work and live together are members of the same family regardless of their behavior, and close people do not have the right to leave them. Zhao Si and Qi admired the behavior of the girl, but they were also interested in the question of whether the boss would share the stones between them. But Lin got angry with the whining of the guys and ordered them to immediately bring the partition so that no one would see how he cast attributes. Meanwhile, something strange was near the eastern city, about 400 meters, next to Mount Beiwan. Even local animals could not hide from multicolored lightning and, in negligence, could burn the wings. As it turned out, the same stranger was present there, which some knew as a devil, from the spell of which Van Ji suffered. But the woman was not alone there, since there was a student of the Shena Palace nearby, named by Sivan. The girl just practiced her skills. As it turned out, before being on this mountain, the girl caused a leadership to report some information. In Sivan, it was necessary to understand the situation between this Jian and that devil, and if you manage to grab it, then the probability that the girl will win in a fight for the status of the successor is much higher. Since childhood, a young student dreamed of this status, so she had a matter of small to grab a villain. Therefore, without wasting time, she took up the task, and when the girl was so close to the devil, there was a sudden explosion. He was quite strong that the student had to move to a safe distance. But when the fire disappeared, then in the place where there was a demoness, there were 2 scraps of fabric. They had the form of little men, from whom colorful smoke emanated, the same as the one that was going from the press near Van Ji. When Sivan took 2 pieces of fabric in her hands, he realized that she was deceived, and now all-day hunting was in vain. However, when she began to look closer to these 2 attributes, she suspected that the devil could seal herself from the inside. When the student focused on his thoughts, he was distracted by an extraneous sound, which seemed to be somewhere behind her. Meanwhile, in the palace of the Jian family, the guests were waiting for the necessary materials to conduct a session of the treatment of the eldest son of a famous family. Soon, the required number of circles was delivered, so the father asked how he could help his heir, but the student said that he needed to wait for his younger comrade, who, for unknown reasons, was very delayed. Zhao Si was already in the yard, along with their friend at Qi, sat silently near the workshop, waiting for their boss. Soon, Tanzhou came up to them, who noticed upset guys and asked what they were doing in this place at such a time. Especially her attention was attracted by the fact that the young man hides something. They said that their boss was casting attributes and asked him to cover. The girl was surprised, because quite a lot of time had already passed, and Lin Tin could not finish this matter. The guys also did not know what the reason. But during the competition, Lin, in a matter of minutes, was able to make 500 attributes without any problems. But suddenly Lin himself appeared between them, who heard this conversation and said that he had long finished. His appearance was too unexpected, so his subordinates and Tan were very scared, as if Tin did so specially. But now for the boy, it did not matter, since he tried to analyze errors during work and was quite pleased with the result. At Qi, he asked for what kind of result was in question, because it was the impression that the boss did not dedicate his team into plans. But Tan thought for a thought, because she is a cultivator and always feels the presence of any people in 10 meters, which she could not do with a linum. It was strange for her that she could not feel a person who stood right behind him, and this was only scared. However, Lin himself was proud of himself, because it turns out that his changes were beneficial, even if Joe could not notice him. When the guy first appeared in the world of cultivators, he found that the fluctuations of the waves of people in this world can be felt using his scanning system. Therefore, he was haunted by the fact that his unusual body and origin would be declassified by some strong cultivators. And if he had not paid attention to this, he would have had problems. And for his own safety, I decided to use spiritual stones and collected knowledge about cultivation, as well as the principle of electronic data of any invisible bomber. With their help, he managed to create a Kotra, makes his feature invisible. One of the capabilities of the invisible bombing is a wave-absorbing material that weakens the reflection of electromagnetic waves, thereby making it invisible. Lin used a similar scheme, and in addition, He took advantage of the spiritual stones and the principles of cultivation, slightly changing each cover, which gives a guarantee that no one will notice it. So now Lin considered himself a real genius, who managed to combine the cultivation and limits of the android, with which he worked before. When Tin told all the details of his work, his behavior and thoughts seemed quite strange for the inhabitants of the world of cultivation. But as it turned out, Tan specifically searched for a guy to tell him the news, which Lin himself had already guessed. The girl told her grandfather about what happened. The old man asked to convey gratitude for the assistance provided in the casting of stakes. After all, without the help of a guy, they would not have coped. But Lin was glad to help, especially thanks to this competition. He was able to find out how exactly the inventory should be made. Having finished the conversation, he turned to Zhao Si and Qi with the words that they needed to go. But the guys had no desire to rush, as it was almost night. Laziness thought for a thought, because they had no options where they did not have. And it would be necessary to look for some refuge on the street. But suddenly Tanzhou intervened and said that the team could stay with them and, besides, will be able to work for the workshop. Tin understood that from the very beginning the girl used it for her own needs, and now it was as if again interested in some kind of benefit. However, the Zhou objected that she exclusively conveys the words of her grandfather, and what to do with this information, the guys should decide for themselves. For Lin, the topic of grandfather was important since childhood, so it would be difficult for him to refuse such a person. But the information from Tan was finished on this, so she said goodbye to new acquaintances and went home, and Lin now was left alone with his thoughts, because he was worried about how to return home to his body. Only the memories of childhood and grandfather were warming his soul, who always tried to teach him something, and made every effort so that Lin grew up a smart boy. The old man had well-owned knowledge about the mechanics of his time, so his grandson was also deepened into this process of creating various machines. And now, being in adulthood, the guy most of all would like to see his dear grandfather, who was his whole family. Having lost his own thoughts, Lin decided not to draw sharp conclusions and just wait for some changes in the new world. Meanwhile, old Jang and his former student were still awaiting to begin healing, but there was still no partner. The guy said that his youngest sent a letter in which he indicated that he, together with his son's father, was used when spiritual taming, to break the shackles that tormented his family and deal with the devil. Now, the old man did not understand why they were just sitting and wasting time. He asked that the students began to do at least something, and with the demoness you can figure it out later. But the guy had a question regarding these shackles, since he knew the level of his own strength, and it would not be enough to solve such a problem. Therefore, he immediately said that together they could not start and still need to wait for his younger colleague. But soon the whole house rose on his ears due to a terrible roar. The eldest son of Jiang's family shouted loudly and could not restrain the pain. As it turned out, his disease suddenly began to progress, and now it was difficult to remove his suffering through painkillers. At that moment, his father burst into tears, because for many years his family showed himself only from the good side. They were always kind to everyone and tried to help. It was not clear to him why God gives such suffering, but his father's tears interrupted the appeal of his youngest son. Then the old man wanted to hear some good news, but not this time. As it turned out, Jainer came to his father only to give him money for another walk. Recently, the behavior of the youngest son was incomprehensible. He did not call about study and family, but only about entertainment. But to the question regarding what wind the guy walks in his head, he replied that the one who brings love. Father was in despair, because he could no longer do anything with his youngest son, who was so indifferent to everything. Therefore, Uncle Van led Jian Era outside, and soon closed the door behind him to always be next to his master. Therefore, a few minutes later, the man approached the Lord and Madame Jian, and asked them about the well-being of the young master. The old man said that the student from Shenhua ordered them to leave the chambers of his son, and now they decide without them what to do next with the patient. All three students all the time stood over Jian's older son, and made sure that his condition would not deteriorate, but could not do without bad news. The problem was that the guys were masters of martial arts, so they did not understand how exactly the attributes should be placed. Then the eldest guy ordered another to shut up and not to disseminate information that they really could not do something. Moreover, the youngest told them that they needed to be near Mr. Jang all the time. Now it remained only to wait for her visit to receive new instructions. Meanwhile, the elder Jean began to open his eyes for the first time in a long time and consider what has happened around the years. In addition to the three students of Shenhua, a black spirit appeared in front of him, which caused a man a strong fear of death, The blue creature began to move and reached out his hand to the patient, taking his face and greeting him. Senior Jian recognized the terrible power, because of which once he became a real cripple and could no longer exist on his own. It was all the work of the devil, who reappeared in this house and hiding on the roof decided to amuse herself. After waiting for the right moment, the rapid demoness applied a spell to unlock the seal imposed on a member of the Jian family. After using this ritual, the man began to shout godlessly, as if something terrible really left his body. Due to the screams, students drew attention to him who should control the treatment process of the eldest son. One of the students decided to check if everything is fine with the patient. Therefore, he came closer and asked the man about his well-being. But when he raised his head, his face looked terribly, and terribly. It was green, all in the veins and in saliva, like a frantic dog. After which he put up his hands that resembled his claws and rushed at the young guy like a real beast on his victim. The student tried to slip out of the hands of a dangerous patient, but he could not be able to cope with one, since he was grabbed right by his neck and blocked his breath. The other two students were afraid to intervene, but they understood that if they did not help the partner in time, they could die at the hands of the young Jiang. Meanwhile, the devil, who played the doll of Mr. Jian, was sitting right over the heads of the guys and controlled his real movements. Soon the father of the patient came to the noise, who began to worry due to noise, and decided that his help would be needed. When he went closer to his son's bed, he noticed that he was trying to hold several men so that he would not jump out. The student explained that apparently, in the young Mr. Jiang, something has been engaged and leads him, so it is difficult to start treatment. But only the blood relatives were able to arouse the consciousness of those in whom they got down. Therefore, the father could try to reach him. Therefore, despite the terrible state of his own son, the man, through pain and tears, agreed to this and went to the guy with the words that he was his dad. Handing through his hands to the young master, who could soon burst the vessels on his face, he wanted to endow his bodies and consciousness with the warmth of his parents. At first it seemed that the guy still calmed down a little, and the saliva from his mouth stopped flowing like a frantic dog. But the lull was not long, because after a few seconds the younger Jian rushed at his father and held him with his teeth by the shoulder. Uncle Van and the students were not ready for this, because they never saw that the spell would progress so much and controls a person. But when they tried to restrain the wild guy, he resisted and was stronger than anyone together in the room. Suddenly, the younger Jian again temporarily calmed down, and his father had the hope that his son would still recover despite such symptoms. But suddenly the boy held out his hand to the torch, who consecrated the whole room and was dangerous, especially at the moment when such a thing falls into the hands of a frantic person who cannot give a report to his actions. Now the whole family was in fear, because each of them had life at risk and was not there to save from such a demon. Meanwhile, Lin with his guys nevertheless agreed to Tan Zhao's proposal and stayed in her workshop. The girl joyfully treated everyone with fruits and good food that their cook was prepared for the whole family. Zhou was not against the new company, especially since Zhou Si and Qi had good friends who could always help. And Van Ji soon recovered, and the next day he could already move independently. However, he was unpleasantly surprised that Lin is still nearby. One of his eyes was enough for Tin to understand his intentions, so he immediately began to shoot with bones from the watermelon. At that moment, Tan Zhao intervened and ordered the men not to arrange a fight, because then everyone would be left without food and work. Jai understood why Lin was so referring to him, but he really acted not of his own free will, and remembered little from what happened last day. Most of all, he remembered a couple of green eyes, which were so close to his face. Namely, after that, everything became like in a fog. Now Van Ji was trying to recall his feelings at the moment when he met his death face to face. But Tanzhou immediately realized that the guy was influenced by the technique of conspiracy. She suspected that it could be someone from the Palace of Souls. Lin Tin did not know that people in the world of cultivation are usually divided into two main categories and live in accordance with them. And the first category is masters of martial arts who ideally own defense and attack techniques. And the second category is masters of magic. They own special techniques that are not subject to ordinary people. Martial artists usually develop physical skills, the damage of which is aimed at the outer part of a person or damage to penetration into the internal. There are only 4 areas of martial arts. It is an external, internal, circulatory system and sensory organs. An example of such a sect is Shena Palace. Mages relate to the inner part of a person. Rarely damage is superimposed on the external one. Such people very skillfully create prints or magic fields. There are 6 areas in which the masters of spells are developing. It is the concentration and collection of key energy, the creation of barriers, ascent. Among the sects with this direction there is one that has a bad glory and is called the Palace of Souls. Lin Tina was most interested in why this sect bears fame, or rather, what could have entailed a similar reputation. But suddenly he intervened at Qi, and said that this is exactly what they and Zhao Si spoke about the boss before. There was a legend that a long time ago the strongest cultivator in the world created a sect of fallen souls. But, being known for his egoism, he hurriedly went to heaven, forgetting about his wards, left without a leader. They began to sow chaos, the hostage of which later became themselves. Simply put, the hasty elevation meant the same thing as a sudden death that had no reason before. When Lin Tin heard these words, he had a question. Can strong cultivators die like ordinary mortals? But there were many examples when they lost their minds, or received a defeat in the struggle, after which they died and their souls dissolved. Followers usually try to rise into heaven, and thereby clear the reputation of their sect. But in general, ascension for its own purpose is almost the same as death. In these two cases, a person leaves this world forever and says goodbye to people. However, due to the fast elevation of the leader of the Palace of Souls, the sect remained unresolved. Like everyone who remains without a head, they scattered, and some of them founded their own currents. Now it was believed that they say the workshop of Tanzhou was some branch of the old Palace of Souls, for in fact the artifact casting workshops exist for all cultivators. However, in this area, it is the Palace of Shenhua that has the greatest force, so Tan is a follower of martial arts. And if we talk about the caster, then this branch is still headed by the Palace of Souls. The remaining surviving followers of this sect are trying to preserve the remains of the palace, combining spells and printing with magic circles. But then they turn off the curve road and eventually go crazy. A few years ago, one talented girl from the Palace of Souls managed to make something that no one could before. However, her actions were extremely gestured, which ruined the reputation of the sect, and the only person who could speak vision and apply such a strong seal to Vanjai was like a shower palace. Lin Tin interpreted this as a person who could teleport people to different worlds, and this could come in handy. Tanzhou did not understand this topic, but she became interested in why Lin asked her this question and why he needed it. Now the guy hoped that he would be able to use the magical circle and teleport to his world, where he would continue ordinary life. Without unnecessary explanations, the young man asked Johu if she knows where to find this talented person, but she had no answer to this question. Suddenly, someone nearby reported that he might know about the whereabouts of the person they are trying to find. As it turned out, it was an unexpected appearance of Jiang in love, who this time came with flowers. He immediately went to Lin Tina and was ready to help him. But the guy did not want to make such close contact. Then said that his father and the whole family were already trying to collect all the information about the master of the spells. Lin did not believe in the words of the young Mr. Jong, so he ordered him to stop saying nonsense and not distract from the search for information. But at that moment Tan remembered that Jian's family really invited the colas of spiritual taming in large numbers, precisely in order to deal with the magician. And Van Ji was much stronger than the average master, however. Even the spell technique affected him. Now the girl had a suspicion that her ex-guy could really know everything, so you need to urgently talk him. Therefore, Zhu went to Jian Era and asked him to tell everything that he knew about the incident between his family and Castor. As it turned out, the guy of the corner of his ear heard from his father that someone had applied equipment to his brother. They found people who, with the help of stakes, can save him. Now the craftswoman lined up a logical plan of action, but she needed to confirm everything from the Jiang family. She suspected that this caster had already met with Van Ji, which means that he knew about the plan of the Era family. Therefore, it is advisable for a guy to run home as soon as possible, and in which case to save the whole family, since it can be dangerous there. However, the ER did not want to go home, as he planned a long walk with Lin Tin, whose female image he fell in love. Then the JOU said that the Air family wanted to neutralize the sinister techniques of the caster. But it seems that Van Ji met on the way of the same magician, and now he knows that they want to get rid of him. The girl grabbed some weapons and was strongly determined to go to Jian's palace, and ordered the children to stay in the workshop. But suddenly her hand was grabbed by Lin, who did not agree to let the lady go alone and wanted to be near that. In which case, he understood that the case with magicians was quite dangerous. Besides, he longed for a personal meeting with this person. However, Tan reported that it could be very dangerous in this place, so she would not want to at the risk of a new friend, but Linnea had nothing to lose after the fact that he had to survive. Therefore, in a calm voice, he said that he did not care. Tan no longer had reasons to doubt this guy, so she still trusted him and allowed him to go together. And Tin was delighted, because it was this person that would be a conqueror, and will be able to help him get home as soon as possible. Suddenly, Janer, who saw that his sister Lin was leaving him, also answered, so he decided that he also had to go with them. Meanwhile, terrible things were taking place in his family's house. The devil was carried away by her power and continued to sow chaos. Dieveloitsa was pleased that she manages to take the lives of innocent people and thereby raise her mood. Soon, from behind the doors of the palace, the eldest son of the Jian family, who led terrible forces, was able to leave with his feet. But besides, next to him was the silhouette of a girl, who apparently had long become a servant of Demoness and carried out her every order. Meanwhile, Lin Tin, along with his small team, hurried to this palace so as not to miss something terrible and help on time. However, the guy wondered whether he should help the young master, who is infinitely in love with his image. Tan said that even Jiang is and irresponsible, but as a person he is good. His family has repeatedly helped her workshop, so she cannot sit back. Lin was surprised that in Jian's family, all as strange as their son. But according to the craftswoman, the older brother was not so until certain circumstances. From childhood, he was distinguished by his mind and was prudent. Shenhua themselves invited him to his team. While friends were talking about the famous Jian family, they did not notice how, by sorrel, they managed to get into their palace. As soon as they got into the territory, Lin saw a strange insect that he had not met earlier in an ordinary world. Therefore, not knowing whether she is safe, the guy decided to press her with his foot, because of which he quickly killed. Suddenly, when Tan and the guy raised his eyes, their gaze changed, and the skin seemed to become green. Jenner barely had time for Linim, because he was not used to such a quick walk. He came the last and was not yet aware of the events. But as soon as he looked around the territory of his own palace, horror and tears appeared in his eyes, which he could not restrain. As it turned out, that night was a bloody moon. But this was not the reason for fear. The bloody bodies of the Jian family members were scattered throughout the house. The only survivor was Ir, and now he could not believe that he was left completely alone, and someone killed his family. When Lin noticed changes in the emotions of the guy, even he felt sorry for him. After all, until recently, he laughed at him, and now such a grief has come. Tan immediately offered a former guy that if necessary, for some time he could live with everyone together in the workshop. However, the man endlessly cried and through incomprehensible words clearly asked if his friends could give him money. Lin was barefoot in this world, so support from him was only moral. And in the workshop, Tan was always a shortage, so she could share food. While friends decided what they had to do for a start, Lin suddenly heard the sound behind, as if someone would grind. He turned back and noticed that one of the students was trying to call for help and speak. Then he ran to a bloodied guy and asked if he could explain what happened to all these people. The student had no strength to speak, and he could hardly pronounce the incomprehensible sounds that were intertwined in a moan. But without giving any hint of the situation, the guy threw his head back. Then he could no longer speak. Linnea was scared, but there was no way to retreat, so he looked at another student with whom the situation was like. The boy begged for help. His body was all in deep wounds and blood passed from his mouth, but he barely raised his hand. When Linnell approached him, the victim repeated the words about help several times, but besides, he could not say anything. And after a few seconds, the soul left his exhausted body, so Lin could not understand why everyone died here after a few words say. Meanwhile, Gina tried to speak with his parents, whose bodies were scattered right in front of the entrance to the palace. Tan and Lin could not interfere at this moment, since the Dorak needed to accept a lot of loss and independently put up with it. However, if this had not lasted so long, then Lin would not scream at the era. But now it was necessary to mobilize and begin to act. Suddenly, the younger brother began to lose consciousness, and the Zhao offered to take him to the house, and only then decide what to do with him. Meanwhile, a small explosion occurred from the outside of the palace, saying something landed on the territory with all its strength. As it turned out, it was the Sivan, who had just finished her affairs, but she understood that she was still very late. Her gaze fell on the murdered insect, which could testify to strong aggression by the devil, saying that she did not even regret a small creature. But while the girl was trying to find out what exactly happened, she heard that there was someone in the house and was very careful. As it turned out, this Lin and Tan barely brought Jian Era into the palace, trying to reanimate the guy who was sitting unconscious. But when Sivan saw two strangers, she immediately suspected that they could be the servants of the devil and try to kill another Jong family member. She recognized the Era, because once during a walk with the eldest son of the family, he decided to introduce the girl to his younger brother. At that time was very shy, and his older brother was not yet injured due to terrible spells. Therefore, now her goal was to save at least one Jong who managed to survive, despite all the terrible events. Sivan had a real lightning who, with force, rushed at strangers and was ready to kill them. Linnea managed to quickly respond and defend Tanjo from a blow who could fall into one of them. Because it was after that a strong hole formed in the wall behind them, through which cracks began to follow the building. Sivan was even more angry, because she failed to kill those whom she considered her enemies the first time. The girl continued to use military equipment to defeat the enemy, and quickly provide assistance to Jianera. She did not even suspect who Lin and Zhou were actually, so she could not realize how much she was mistaken. The inner student of the palace Shenhua for a long time mastered the arts in desertness, so how much Lin and Zhou were dexterous seemed strange to her. However, as it turned out, Tan also studied in the palace. But outside, usually they are always cultivated in the outer part of the court. The girl was sure that this Sivan became the one who destroyed the Jian family. The situation was unpleasant, since now two students of the same sect fought against each other, who had never met before. This information became known to Linnea, as he used his analyzer. Therefore, the struggle between the two girls was strange for him. Sivan was already tired of continuing the exhausting struggle, so she wanted to end this with one blow. At that moment, Lin again launched a scanning system to understand how strong his opponent could be. As it turned out, the student's combat power grew every minute, and was already a size of 1,500 units. At that moment, Tin decided to stop the fight, and told the stranger that he would not do anything bad to her, but only wants to return to his homeland. However, Sivan was not going to listen to him, and with the words that now she would help him return, she hit the guy in the head with all her strength. After the blow received, Lin flew off by almost a dozen meters, because the force that the student attached was deadly. Therefore, as a result of his flight, the guy landed on Jianera, who finally came to his senses from shock. But the girls did not plan to stop, and the JW was ready to use sharp weapons to finally end it. However, as soon as she barely thrust the spear at the target, the boss with the help of 2 fingers was able to stop the weapon. At that moment, Zhou realized that she was not a caster, since the girl owned excellent battle technology, which testified to her origin. But even more, the craftswoman had a fear after her rival was able to break her fingers with her fingers. Now there was nothing between the girls that could interfere with negotiations, but not one of them was tuned in a peaceful decision. Sivan still longed for the death of 2 strangers, so she was ready to spend at least all his strength, but to preserve Jianera's life. The students became even greater enemies in each other's eyes, as they could not stop for a moment and discuss their goal. Therefore, without expecting a response, the Sivan became in her comfortable pose, from which she performed a strong jump forward. But Lena managed to get ahead of her and calculate the opportunity to put a bandwagon to a girl who was definitely not ready for this. Therefore, instead of delivering a decisive blow, she with shame fell face directly into the ground. This was her first unsuccessful attack. Tan froze in place in surprise. She was sure that something terrible happened to the Linum after he flew away, and Sivan could not believe how the guy managed to survive after such a blow, given his outer fragile look. Laziness was pleased with himself, and did not hide the knowledge of how cool he was, and even with a small action, he was able to stop such a fighter. Suddenly, Zhou began to laugh at the rival, who looked as if she had driven a tank and she could only lie on the floor. But Sivan itself was not ready that the enemies could be so strong. Her internal energy was developed to such a level that it could intercept all the attacks, but did not notice this bandwagon. And Lin, the invisible coating, was activated, because the girl managed to leave a dent on his steel skeleton and damage the material that was responsible for the memory. Therefore, it was dangerous to fight her face to face, and it was necessary to attack from behind. Meanwhile, Jang Er could not calm down, because after such an arrival his stomach ached a lot, and the guy loved to regret himself. However, he soon managed to get to his feet, and he was surprised at the picture that he saw in front of him. His acquaintances fought among themselves. Suddenly, Sivan answered the young man that now there was no way to talk, because she needs to overcome enemies. But the young master was still not clear why to do this. Therefore, he first introduced Tanjo, who was a master of smelting artifacts. Then he pointed to Lin, whom he still called his sister, and introduced him as a girl in whom he is in love. But when Tin turned to face him, the young master was frightened, because instead of a beautiful face, he saw a dent. From what he saw, he almost lost his soul, like everyone else who was in the courtyard of the palace. Then Tanjo decided to say hello and noted that she was a student of the Shena Palace. Sivan was also delighted to find her colleague. Soon the memory of Lin was restored and his face returned to the usual form. He could not imagine how many people could be in the sect, that they did not even know each other. Then Jian came up to him and talked about his terrible dream, where he saw, instead of a sweet face, Lin, something incomprehensible. Meanwhile, the girls talked among themselves and discussed the fact that they need to find a girl from the Palace of Souls. But as it turned out, Sivan managed to examine the house and noticed that Jian and also disappeared. They tried to think through the detailed plan, but suddenly Jian intervened in the conversation and ordered the girls to stop. He was worried about the fact that there was almost a hole in the wall of his house and tried to find out who ruined his property. Sivan could not believe that the guy really did not understand how terrible events occurred in this place, and Lin did not voice his opinion. But from the very beginning he was confident in stupidity Jian, who looked after him. After a short conversation with Tan, Sivan remembered her last visit to this palace when she talked with the elder Jong. When she came, her husband complained about an old disease, which he received about 10 years ago during a fight with bastards from the Palace of Souls. The elder asked the girl to be careful. However, she was sure that her skills could be enough to even fight with several people at the same time. However, she did not think that the technique of her enemies could differ from her, so she would not be able to go against. The girl studied martial arts, but there was no idea how much spells could be strong. If they launch magic, then Sivan will not have a single chance, because when they fought against the Palace of Souls at one time, they and supporters used a special seal, which the old man shared with the student. These were the shackles of the soul. To activate the seal, it is necessary to install 100 circles of spiritual taming. All magical techniques that fall in the field of action lose their effectiveness, and everyone who is in this trap will not be able to escape from it. All that remains them is to fight with your bare hands. It would be a lot of time to arrange several hundred circles. Laziness understood that this plan requires improvements. According to the guy, the Sivan seemed to be so strong but stupid at the same time, so as not to notice such a mistake. He voiced his words out loud. So when the girl heard, he almost threw him at him. It's good that the JW was nearby. This reaction of the student only proved her impulsivity in childhood. But without her help, they may not cope. The guy was sure that it would be good to develop a IQ rating among all the characters that he managed to meet in this world, and in his opinion, only his mind could win, since artificial intelligence and brain were arranged in his head. As for Tanjo, she was an ordinary person in development, but much smarter than other inhabitants. Janer is a son from a rich family, and Sivan had a temper and a tendency to rash decisions. Although she was smarter than Jean, she did not go far in intelligence. Now the question concerned the same devil from the Palace of Souls. She seemed very insidious and cunning, so she entered the top of the most intelligent characters of the Linja list. Now it was not clear to him why the elder of the Palace Shenhua sent a stupid participant to deal with a cunning criminal. At OM, Tan came up to him and said that her colleague offered to try to rush on the trail of the devil, and she would like to join. Lin agreed to the proposal and wanted to take a step forward, but he seemed uncertain, and the guy's body almost fell. His face seemed to be green and caused embarrassment of Joe, who was worried about the condition of his friend. Suddenly, before the eyes of Lin, a warning appeared from the system that his energy was 16% of 100. His android worked on solar energy, and he was already spinning half of the night like a squirrel in a wheel, and soon his body could simply turn off. Sivan noticed that the guy became bad, but instead of help, she simply made fun of him and rejoiced at his failure. But despite his condition, Lin replied that she would still beg him for help in order to find that devil. Suddenly, Sivan took out a high-level search artifact, which belonged to the Shena Palace, and was a compass of sky and land. Zhao was surprised when she saw this thing. After all, having access to this compass, Sivan failed to find a criminal, and he circled her around his finger. They shamed the student in the words, and she did not know what to answer. She came up with, "They say she forgot about the presence of this subject." But while the girls argued among themselves, Lin decided not to intervene in their conversation because something else attracted his attention. He had a rather sharp hearing, so he could notice every movement somewhere nearby, which is why he sharply reacted to the noise. When the guy turned around, he noticed the same cockroach that he killed before entering the territory of the palace. To understand why the insect came to life again, Lin applied the possibility of analysis and brought his eyes to the risen insect. At that moment, the system issued information that spiritual energy appeared in the cockroach, which he had already felt somewhere before. Now the guy had a suspicion that all this time of the conversation, the enemy followed them and tried to eavesdrop on the plan. Laziness felt that he had to change the course of their events in order not to put his own life and new friends under danger. Soon he turned to Tanzhou and quietly said that he would not go with them. He hid his gaze so as not to cause unnecessary suspicions, but when asked why he wouldn't go, said that this was not his showdown and he should not poke his nose into other people's affairs. Zhou was not against such a decision, but the Sivan was only more angry with him and began to contact offensive terms. But before leaving a kind of team, Lin Tin again turned to the Zhao and carefully shook her sleeve. At that moment, the girl realized that the guy was trying to carefully give her some information, but could not do it publicly. Then Lin said that he needed to return to the workshop and pick up his bag, after which he asked where the ZHOU put it. While they were discussing a neutral topic, the risen cockroach came closer and followed them from Paul. And when friends parted in different places, the dark power was only delighted and felt as if now she would be able to become famous. But now a new task was given a pretty devil. She needed to deal with 2 girls who studied in the Shena Palace. The girl herself was not happy to follow all these instructions, and, on the contrary, she was disgusted from who was led by her all the time. As it turned out, it was about the old and terrible look of the old woman. She was sure that even when her servants would die, she would live forever. Soon, Lin returned to the workshop and read the seal, which he received from the Sivan, to perform a rite with circles. It was necessary to use a lot of energy, which the guy had little. At Qi and Zhao Shi, they could not understand why the boss returned so late and for what he needed so many things. But now the main thing for the line was to maintain the energy that remained until dawn in order to recharge again. Suddenly Grandfather Tan came out, who asked the children why they did not sleep at that later time. He was especially worried about the question of where the granddaughter is located. At that moment, Lin felt strong responsibility and memories of his dear grandfather, by whom he missed. Therefore, he immediately approached the old man and asked him not to be worried. Having come up with the story that he, along with the JW, was conducting an inventory, he managed to reassure his grandfather. He decided to give the children the opportunity to work alone, but emphasized that they would not be delayed for a long time, because it is also necessary to relax. After the old man went back to the bed, Lin was relieved to exhale, because he managed not to worry his grandfather once again. But now it was necessary to move on to the implementation of the plan, and pointing to Zhao Si. The boss said that the guy would carry his things, and he also did not leave Qi without work and said that this guy would carry him himself to the right place. The guys began to be capricious. They say they did not want to go at such a later time somewhere from the house, but they had no choice. Now that Lin spent less energy on movement, he activated the search engine arranged by the android. She led him to the very forest in which Lin found himself a few days ago, and began his new life in this world. Meanwhile, Sivan decided to use her compass of land and heaven, which led it to the same forest. Tanzhou, who followed the instructions of her colleague and was ready to ensure her in the instructions of her colleague. Soon the compass pointed to a specific place, namely a huge oak, behind him, as if there was a big radiance to which it was necessary to go. The girls carefully approached the tree and tried to see what was in that place without too much noise. As it turned out, it was there that there was a terrible old woman who held Jian's body, and in a large green ball, who radiated this radiance. Sivan barely restrained her aggression in his fist, but this was difficult for the girl, and she could suddenly attract attention. Tanzhou intervened in time and asked her colleague so that she would not act so rash so that their plan would not break. Tan noticed some changes. In warm nights, flickering in the forest always attracted reptiles and different insects. But since the girls were in this place, not a single chirping or buzzing of other insects was heard. The devil felt that the girls nevertheless approached her, so she decided that she was enough to hide. Therefore, waiting for the right moment, the woman took off her hood and finally showed the real person at least to one of the cultivators. She was satisfied with the fact that she could no longer hide her beauty, and at least someone would appreciate her beauty. At that moment, when Tanzhou looked at the devil, she recognized in her Chishaman, whom she had already heard about before. But the demoness was not going to join the conversation, but turned to her queen, who reported that the victims had come to them. After that, the woman began to rush in the air and radiated a green glow, which accompanied each trace of terrible power. Suddenly she landed to the floor, and at that moment, a strong flow of energy turned out to be, which grew throughout the forest. But while the girls tried to understand how exactly they needed to act, they did not notice that something terrible was happening behind them. Suddenly, an old spellman appeared from a tree, who immediately held out her old hands to Tanzhou and tried to scare her. However, at that moment, Sivan intervened, which tried to strike her strong blow to the terrible old woman who unexpectedly appeared. But at that moment, a huge scolopendra rushed at the girl, who tried to attack her and limit the movement of the Sivan. Tanjo was terribly worried about her friend, but her strength was not enough to overcome the enchanted insect. The creation of the beginning is increasingly compressing the bodies of girls, which is why they almost could not move and save themselves on their own. Then Qi Xiaomana approached Sivan and asked with a smile that all the students from the Shenhua Palace really are so stupid that they themselves fall into the traps. Sivan was ready to get out of imprisonment as soon as possible and put an end to the devil, which she was already tired of it. The girls did not have a single chance to free themselves from such a trap. So with each of their movement, the conclusion became even stronger. Soon the old spellman herself appeared, who offered to simply kill the girls and end it. But Qi Xiaomanis wanted to have fun and pay with the girl who spent 3 days in search of her. The old sorceress was all the same as in the end to do with the girls. But her subordinate Qi Shaman thirsty for revenge and strict bullying. And suddenly the devil took out of the pocket of the improved Scorpio, which had sharp legs and was influenced by black magic. She took a gray face by her face and bringing her mouth to her mouth said that it was a pleasure to swallow such, and wanted to do it. At that moment, Tan realized that she needed to use the last chance, and making a deep exhalation, she released a little lightning from her mouth. She was blue and quickly flashed through the head of the head, thereby attracting the attention of the rest. Magic lightning was between 2 witches, and resembled a small star, which was about to grow up 100 times. Qi Xiaomania smiled and asked if it was in the Shenhua Palace. There are people who can hide weapons in their mouths. While the Ju suffered from Scolopendra's compression, she managed to say that it was just a spit and nothing special. Then she began to carefully bring her finger to the body of a giant beast, and her hand suddenly lit up. Therefore, after her sudden touch, the body of Scolopendra was torn into 2 parts, and the girl said that this was her real weapon. The devil and her lady were surprised at what happened, because they did not count on any conclusions during the murder of girls. It also managed to get out of the encirclement of a terrible animal in the blue, so she tried to help her friend. To begin with, she decided that Tanzhou would be better to go to save Jian, yes, and she herself is dealing with these terrible witches. However, hearing a fracture plan, Qi Xiaoman was not afraid of a drop, because she calculated everything in advance and was ready for any course of events. She told the girls that they should not rejoice so quickly, because they do not know something. Then the devil took up magic, and straightening her hands, she demonstrated that this part of the forest in which they are located is subject to her magical circle. After her last words, everything in the forest seemed to be controlled by the words of Qi Xiaoman, so even the trees rushed at the girls. The devil wanted to disappear and not interfere with the death process, although for her the contemplation of this has always been some kind of entertainment. Suddenly, at Sivan she ordered a woman to stop, but she was not going to listen to her orders and just went. But at that moment, Tanzhou realized that she is a caster, so it is quite expected that she was ready for everything, just not to fight directly. It was quite emotional into the Sivan, so I spent a lot of time on the words to insult my enemy and at least somehow hurt. However, in addition, she had good skills, for which she needed to calm down and concentrate, and when the girl's breath was leveled, Tanzhou felt a special energy that only students of the internal palace could create. Sivan did not have to use such techniques most earlier, but now the situation was critical and raised the question of life. Therefore, having put as much energy as possible in her hands, the girl struck a strong blow to the thickets that surrounded them. An explosive wave almost formed from a strong blow, from which the girls themselves could suffer. But despite the bright flash, the enchanted plants were stronger and did not get any damage from the Sivan. Tanzhou was really proud of the power of her friend, but she never managed to free them from this captivity of plants. And suddenly, in a matter of minutes, the thickets began to move and dry, turn into straw, which is easy to break. This attracted the attention of Qi Xiaoman, who did not expect this level of strength of the students of the Shenhua Palace and greatly underestimated them. Now for the advice, she turned to her lady, who said that this is the branded technique of the courtyard of the palace Shenhua, so not everyone can own it. She combines an attack from 3 stages with the help of only movement. This is similar to stormy waves with a strong underwater flow. The energy released by such movements is directed into blows and circulates until it ends. The old woman was only happy because she felt how the girls were approaching her, and she would still manage to end them with her own. Kishiomani decided to stay with Jian, yes, and the old woman asked her to deal with the girls, but the caster was not going to easily deal with them. so she wanted to use her special equipment with insects. She managed to release hundreds of large flies from her own body, which, at the direction of her, attack any person. And when the insects were released, they flew into the light of the bloody moon, which was special that terrible night. And while Tanjo and Sivan tried to break through to the devil, they heard a strange noise somewhere behind. All birds in another part of the forest suddenly began to fly to other places, and Lin Tin also drew attention to the roar. Meanwhile, his subordinates have already finished with the installation of stakes and were very tired, not to mention Jian Era. But in order to reward the guys for their help, Lin decided to give them something in order to facilitate their training. It was about the books that he managed to rewrite after he visited the attributes for cultivation. It was the best gift for the guys, and their boss was worried that they physically could not put all the cola in a short time. Therefore, having a new plan, Tin decided to independently go deeper into the forest, and Zhao Si and Qi ordered to wait for him. The system again reported a low level of charge, so Lin hoped that he would be able to at least do something until his body was turned off. Meanwhile, the girls tried to quickly find Jian Yes, who was captured by the devils, but now they had a certain obstacle. The insects attacked them everywhere and did not allow them to take a step, so it soon became clear that it was another trap. Then Tanjo ordered Sivan to distract her insects, and the craftswoman herself would try to save the eldest son of the Jong family. Now they had at least some plan, and the student of the internal palace became defensive flies, which were becoming more and more. Meanwhile, the devil and her mistress all awaited the right moment for them to quickly deal with rivals. But according to Qi Xiaoman, they could wait. And first of all, it was necessary to figure out the end of the ritual over the prisoner guy. But as soon as they started work, suddenly and rapidly appeared at Sivan, which ordered women to stop. Then Xiaomani got angry with the old woman due to the fact that she did not fulfill her duty and did not stop those who could interfere with them. Meanwhile, the student became alert and asked the devil not to run away, but to become one-on-one and decide this struggle. While the girl distracted the witches, Tanjo managed to carefully approach the same territory to save Jian Yes. The girl tried to understand what it was with the guy, and, as it turned out, around him created a magic circle that closes the soul. It turns out that Jian not dies until the circle is destroyed. Otherwise, his soul will dissipate. Qi Xiaomani did not pay attention to the JW and took up Sivan, who was already tired of her sudden visits to her life. And now the devil was seriously configured against the girl and began to use magic again. This time, from one movement with the fingers of Qi, all the trees around began to sparkle with blue light, which was part of dark magic. Suddenly, a strong explosion occurred, as if two lightning crossed each other, and this happened right in front of the Sivan. At that moment, the girl began to feel the strange smell that came from every object in this forest. Qi Xiaoman smiled, and again emphasized that everything in this part of the land belongs to her control. But from the very beginning, the woman just wanted to play with the Sven. But the latter began to bother her very much, and the action plan changed. Therefore, now Qi was aggressively configured and directly told the girl that she was going to get rid of her. From this idea, the demoness seemed to go crazy and received additional energy, so without hesitating, she got down to business. Suddenly, she directed her hand to the ground on which she stood at the Sivan, and a blue flash formed right under it. At that moment, the girl already managed to say goodbye to life, since her skills would not be enough to resist the strength of members of the tamed Soul's Palace. And after the flash and the sound wave disappeared from it, a bright glow in the open air came, which illuminated the entire night forest. But despite what happened, the Sven still stood alive, and the same could be said about the devil. Meanwhile, Tanjo watched Jian and noticed that the magic circle began to dissipate in the air, which portended bad news. Qi Xiaoman did not understand what was happening. All her blue radiance began to leave the objects of the forest, and at that moment her magic circle was destroyed. Suddenly Lin Tin appeared in front of her, who held one of the circles and said that everyone would not puzzle his head, that it was his hand. The guy wanted to get as much gratitude as possible, but Sivan could not say a word after she almost met with her death. But Tanjo was not happy with the result of the deed of Lin. After all, now, due to the destruction of the magic circle, Jian and will die very quickly. Qi Xiaomani got angry with the guy, because she had to spend a lot of time and her own energy in order to carry out this ritual. Now Sivan only did that she laughed even more at the guy, who she had so disliked before that. Lin Tina was unpleasant due to the fact that he himself spent a lot of resources in order to save girls who were now not grateful to him. Meanwhile, Tan noticed changes in Jian Yes, who was dying right before her eyes and she could not help him. His soul continued to dissipate, because of which the physical body also suffered, which already underwent strong consequences. But besides, a silhouette of an unfamiliar girl who seemed to come out of his body began to appear behind him. But in a matter of seconds, strange things began to happen with Tanjo itself, and the girl fell to the floor in strong convulsions. Sivan suspected that the girl had a white fever, but Lin immediately realized that the work of Chishaman was here. Then the woman emphasized that the guy thinks about the result of his actions. He destroyed her magic circle, which took a lot of time. Therefore, after destruction, the souls decided to approach the nearest living person. Now, although not long, they will spin around him. And most of all in the life of the devil hated two types of people: those who order her to do what to do and those who destroy her plans. It was these two personalities that united in the line. However, the guy perceived this simply as anger in his direction and noted that the demoness would not be able to do anything since he destroyed her circle. But as it turned out, he managed to make a simplified version. Before starting to arrange the cola, he realized that he would not have time to do everything in an hour. Moreover, when he turned around, he noticed a bright radiance in the sky, which indicated not how quickly it was necessary to act. And having launched the scanning system, Lin learned that there are 27 energy channels on the territory. Therefore, first of all, in order to destroy the magic circle, it was necessary to limit access to these 27 points. And now, when he stood opposite a strong enemy, he hoped that his plan would really work and would not have to redo everything. However, the devil was also not going to give up just so, and decided to try the secret technique of the Palace of Souls, the brilliant bonds of death. Therefore, without losing hope of victory, the woman spread her hands to the sky and ordered dark magic to rebel behind her. But as it turned out, only one leaflet from a tree fell from such a loud scream, which was rather cut off by the wind, and no dark magic appeared. From what he saw, Sivan and Lin Tin only began to mock Chi Shaman even more, who so disgraced her reputation. Therefore, now the student of the inner palace ordered the guy to deal with the old woman and her insects, and she wanted to start demoness. However, only now, Lin drew attention to the fact that that old woman disappeared somewhere, and there was no trace left in place for the last time she was seen. Chi Xiaomani was also not happy with the disappearance of the old woman, since now she would have to fight for her existence on her own. This was noted by Sivan when she suddenly rushed at a woman who no longer had the opportunity to use magic. And now the girl again concentrated power in her hand to deliver a decisive blow to the opponent. As a result, unexpectedly for the student, the devil managed to stop her movement with one hand, which she extended forward. Now the young warrior was shocked by the fact that the caster without magic can resist her strong blows. But as it turned out, Chi Xiaoman could be quite strong despite the fact that her magic circle was destroyed. Sivan did not know how to do it further, so she decided to consult with Clearly Tin, who kept her feet on her feet. Meanwhile, green patterns appeared on the skin of demonesses, after which she said that she was a special genius who was brought up in the shower palace. Then Lin realized that the woman had used a magic circle. That is, now she was herself a source of magic. It turns out that the simplified version of the blocking formation does not work on it. When Sivan heard what the guy was talking about, then she asked if it was possible to somehow find out exactly what kind of magic circle the demoness possesses. But Chi Xiaoman managed to eavesdrop on the conversation, and she said that herself could tell in more detail about her capabilities. However, in order not to use words, the woman immediately demonstrated how to rapidly strike the enemy. Tina succeeded, and the Grey managed to evade, but the guy realized that the woman could now absorb the enemy's attacks. Then she corrected him, and said that her possibility is to absorb the attack, but then release it from a different angle. Therefore, now having more information, Lin remembered the spatial technique that was extremely powerful. Suddenly, Xiaoman began to complain that it was quite difficult for her to select the necessary conditions and suitable souls. And given the situation, she could already become immortal. But Lin ruined everything to her, and now she longed for revenge. Tin understood what the woman was driving towards, so he made a confident step forward and said that she took revenge on him and rather killed him. But when Sivan was behind the guy and already wanted to stop him, she noticed something special. The boy in his hand held one single circle of Taming of the Soul, thanks to which he could try to defeat the devil. Lin tried to quietly explain that in order to destroy the magic circle of the demoness inside the body, he needed to touch it around the spiritual taming. At that moment, Chi Xiaomanus realized that the guy had some kind of plan, but she could not read his thoughts, and Tin whispered softly that when the Sivan would compete with the enemy, he should strike her with this circle, which he would give her. However, the girl did not understand what he was trying to convey to her, and taking a stake in her hands asked why he poked her with this thing. At that moment, Lin could not stand it, and had already begun to scream on the bond for the fact that it was stupid, and cannot even understand elementary explanations. Qi Xiaomani realized what was being discussed, and decided to admit that one of this team is really cunning, but with such a partner, they would not be able to overcome it. Having no time for long conversations, Lin directly said that when the Sivan would compete with Qi, he stuck a sharp circle into it and destroyed the magic circle inside it. The girl finally understood and admitted that the line is rather smart, but soon the guy came a message about the reduction of the charge. At that moment, Xiaoman laughed and asked if someone would really believe that she would be able to touch her at least for a split second. Laziness tried to motivate the gray and said that the devil was trying to offend her, and she still stands idle. And for Xiaoman, it seemed strange that the guy did not want to end her on his own, but asks to make someone else. Now she came to the conclusion that he could be a caster. Therefore, now not having time for conversation, the woman set herself a goal as soon as possible to deal with Lin Tin. Therefore, now she was the first to rush into a fight and at an extraordinary speed ran directly to the Sivan, behind which the guy stood. As soon as the woman ran past the student of the Shena Palace, the girl tried to touch the enemy's body around. But as it turned out, everything was in vain, as she missed and she failed to destroy the magic circle inside the demoness. Meanwhile, Xiaoman continued to run, since her goal was Lin, which was powerlessly standing in front of her. When the guy saw the danger, he began to scream and beg for a calm truce, but it was too late. During the autumn seconds, the devil grabbed his hand, and there was no longer where to run, since it was impossible to escape from her trap. The woman called the line a cunning, and directly asked what he was planning to do against her. But he again had a warning about 6% of the charge. Qi Xiaomani's emphasized that she is the only one who can build conspiracies against others, but not a single person has the right to do it against her. However, her words did not frighten the guy, and he only looked into her eyes with a smile and asked, was she really confident in her words? The woman did not understand such a confidence of the young man in her actions, so she looked at him with interest. And at that moment, the line of the light movement of the hand managed to remove the body of the devil, who tried to stay with all his might. She did not understand how the ordinary cultivator managed to reject her trap and not fall under the influence of magic. But as it turned out, Lin prepared well in advance, and he managed to put one of the circles right inside his hand. Because from the very beginning, he doubted that a simplified version would help him defeat the demon girl. Therefore, I decided to hide several coats in my hands to crush them with some blocks of the magic circle. And now, when he had only 3% of the charge left, he was not able to continue the battle. So he waited for the woman herself to fall into his trap. He began to squeeze the devil strongly, and even once could not think that she herself would just believe in this circus. The smaller the charge remained, the faster the battery lost energy, and now it only remained to wait for the sun. Lin looked into the eyes of Sivan, and at the last percentage said that now the matter remains behind her, and he did the main thing. After the order, his battery was completely discharged and the metal body fell directly on Qiumen, who tried to throw him off. In a silver, she fled to the aid, and now the devil began to worry about the fact that her death would really occur so quickly. The first tears appeared before her eyes, because she was not able to finish the rites, which have already become the meaning of her existence. The student of the internal palace, Shenhua, suddenly stopped her run and decided to be careful in sharp actions. And Qi Xiaoman, who considered herself a real genius of the Palace of Souls, did not want to fall into the hands of a stupid girl who had hunted her for so long. But the picture, when Lin was stuck in the hugs of Qi, seemed strange to the Sivan, and she made the conclusions that these people are close to each other. Her stupidity just played in the hands of the demoness, and she realized how lucky she was that it was precisely from the whole company. After all, Tanzhou was still unconscious, and around her body continued to hide the souls of those who died from dark magic. Namely, it was about Jian and a stranger, the silhouette of which has not yet been disclosed for students.